But now over to today's talk with my colleague Niels Krabbe, that is actually in the room next to me, and he will talk about who owns the genetic resources of the deep seas. So I turn over to you, Niels. Stop sharing here.
Oh,
Very
thank you very
welcome.
much. Thank you very much. So my name is Niels Krabbe. I'm a researcher with the Department of Law, just like Lena, where I've been for the past 5 years. And my research area is also connected to the previous positions I've held for different Swedish governmental agencies, working with the WTO law at the National Board of Trade and the law of the sea and UN oceans processes and negotiations with the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. So my research is sort of colored by these previous lives. So I first want to thank Carl-Johan and Malin for inviting me. There was some initial confusion regarding dates. I saw that different dates were communicated. So if any of you tried to log in yesterday, it's good that you're joining again today. Also, of course, I'm really sad we're doing this online. It seems like there are different approaches across the university. At the law department, we're back at campus, which is really good for me because I'm a real life person. So if anyone finds this presentation difficult to comprehend, it is because of the lack of physical representation. After all, the topic for today's talk is the legal status of life. So it's really quite ironic that we're doing this on video telephone. At least it's live. I'd be happy to invite you to the law department to discuss it further if anyone wants to hear more after this brief and rather short presentation. So I was asked to talk about my thesis, which looks like this. Oh yeah, you have to put things really close to the camera on Zoom, unless you're a person. Oh, wait. I defended it in June, so roughly half a year ago, although it really already feels like a long time ago. And the book is about 600 pages and is the result of 4 years of research. So I'll of course have to leave out important parts of it when discussing it here. And with these caveats in mind, let's proceed to the actual topic for today. I'll try to share my presentation here. Oh, here we go. Can you see my slide? At least Malin can.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
As long as the communicators can see the slides, it's fine, I think. Well, what I set out to do in this book was to examine how public international law considers human biotechnological use of genetic resources from the deep seas, beyond the jurisdiction of states, and what this legal problem says about international law and its development. Does international law function coherently when facing problems such as this, which transcend different legal regimes and different legal areas? I'll explain what that means in a while. And to be more precise, what I've examined is what international law says about taking samples from organisms in the parts of the oceans where no state has special rights, and use findings from these examinations of these samples as the basis for developing products, such as, for instance, pharmaceuticals. In part, it connects to an ongoing negotiations for a new treaty for biological diversity beyond national jurisdiction, which is currently ongoing at the UN, although it's been paused due to the pandemic. And I will get back to this connection at the end of the talk. It's also important to bear in mind that this project has a geographic limitation, or jurisdictional limitation, rather. What I'm investigating is specifically areas beyond national jurisdiction. And since the law of the sea has different rules for the water column and the seabed, this means two things, actually. Firstly, the waters beyond the exclusive economic zones of coastal states, which may extend to a maximum of 200 nautical miles from the baseline. So basically waters beyond the 200 nautical mile line of the coast. These waters are sometimes referred to as international waters. The term used under the Law of the Sea Convention is the high seas. I think I have a slide showing it here. Oh yeah. And secondly, it also means the seabed and underlying sediments beyond the continental shelf of coastal states. And this is often called the deep seabed, but under the law of the sea, it has the somewhat confusing name, the area with a capital A. So this sort of twofold regime under the Law of the Sea Convention makes it rather complex since the high seas may not entirely overlap with the area in terms of where it extends. As you see on this slide, the continental shelf may in many cases extend beyond the 200 nautical mile zone of the EEZ. And basically that means that in some places, the seabed may be continental shelf under national jurisdiction, whereas the water column may be high seas, thus beyond national jurisdiction. So what I'm talking about is then sort of commons areas beyond the jurisdiction of states. Now, why is the legal status of genetic resources from these deep sea areas of the oceans interesting? Well, there are actually two reasons for the interest in these objects and in this particular problem. Firstly, because the deep seas conceal some of the organisms with the most peculiar properties found on this planet. These properties are attracting increasing interest from research and development, including basic research for the development of pharmaceuticals. And secondly, because the deep seas not only conceal some of the strangest creatures of the biosphere, the legal regime provided for these parts of the oceans is one of the strangest creatures of international law. So to start with a bit of deep sea biology, the marine areas beyond national jurisdiction, of which the largest parts are deep seas, comprises of 2/3 of the total surface of the world's oceans and constitutes about 4/5 of all marine waters measured in volume. And yet these parts of the oceans were long believed to be biological deserts. Although the deep sea is still less explored than the surface of Mars, recent exploration and research has put paid to the idea that the deep sea is a lifeless zone. Expeditions conducted during the past 2 decades have established that life is not only abundant in the deep sea, but actually more diverse and endemic than in most places of the biosphere. It has been estimated that between 500,000 and 100 million species live in the deep sea portions of the world's oceans. For example, as much as 10% of the total living biomass on Earth probably exists as oceanic subsurface bacteria, most of it unidentified. And similarly, the deep sea floor beneath the open ocean has a topography which is comparable in complexity to the terrestrial environment and hosts an abundant variety of organisms. So the high seas conceal some of the world's most exceptional species and extraordinary habitats. And to a large degree, this can be explained by the conditions for life in the deep seas, which are among the most challenging of the entire biosphere. In order to exist in these areas, organisms have developed abilities to withstand immense pressure and complete darkness. And as a result, life exhibits its most extreme forms in the deep sea. Indeed, the challenges for life in these environments has made evolution take turns not seen in other environments. One well-known example of this is the Extremophiles living in the proximity of deep sea vents at mid-ocean ridges, which have developed unique properties. These include not only the ability to withstand extreme pressures and temperatures, but also complete independence from the photosynthesis. Instead, some of these organisms depend on the sulfur cycle, So this basically means that if the sun turned out from one day to the next, these organisms would be completely unaffected. Another less visually documented example is the dark biosphere, an entire ecosystem living without light or oxygen, flourishing beneath the ocean floor. Similarly, based on chemosynthesis, it is potentially one of the planet's biggest ecosystems, but certainly not very well explored. And this high degree of genetic diversity and prevalence of usual function, which is the result of deep sea conditions, substantially increases the likelihood of valuable bioprospecting findings, because what you try to find when you look for useful genetic properties are these sort of extreme properties which may have useful functions for humans in pharmaceuticals and other applications. And of course, the prospects for deep sea bioprospecting are further amplified by the lack of previous exploration. Areas beyond national jurisdiction, the vast majority of which are in the deep sea, represent the largest environments on the planet. Yet they are also the least understood. This world beyond the jurisdiction of states is largely unexplored. The ratio of new discoveries in the deep ocean is 1:1 for each of the samples taken. The overwhelming majority of deep sea species remained undiscovered and are yet to be described. It is thus not surprising that the commercial interest in and potential for genetic exploration of deep sea organisms is high, rising, and certainly increasing. So there are a lot of different understandings of what law applies to these deep sea areas beyond national jurisdiction. This would be the Samuel Jackson version of international law. It's not actually correct, but what is interesting is that coincidentally, the peculiar elements of deep sea biology are paralleled by equally fascinating legal aspects. Of course, these waters are, as I said before, and the seabed as well, not under the jurisdiction of states. This does, however, not mean that states or Samuel L. Jackson can do whatever he wants in areas beyond national jurisdiction. They are actually subject to a rather complex legal regime based on two radically different commons concepts. And of course, commons means in a broad sense that these are areas and resources which does not belong to any individual states, but rather could be considered as common pool resources. As regards the water column, they are subject to what's called in the law of the sea convention the high seas freedoms. And basically these freedoms entail an open access regime, but certain general obligations apply if you want to, for instance, extract resources. As regards the seabed or the area as it is called under the law of the sea convention, it has a rather peculiar legal regime which is dominated or underpinned by a legal principle called the principle of common heritage of mankind, which basically says that no state can appropriate the seabed, the deep seabed, or its resources. Instead, resources in this part of the ocean belong to all of humankind. And in case any state is interested in extracting resources in these parts of the seas, that must follow certain procedures, be accepted and licensed by a specific international agency or mechanism, the International Seabed Authority. And importantly, use of deep seabed resources cannot be used as the basis for setting private claims. And this raises a number of complicated issues in relations to other treaties of international law, which I will return to in a while. So, but in addition to this sort of twofold commons regime with very different implications, remember the main rule in the high seas is open access, whereas in the deep seabed, access is generally prohibited unless you have a specific permit and you follow the common heritage of mankind principle and connected rule. Very different rules. In addition to these different regimes, there is also a specific set of rules regulating marine scientific research, which is considered a distinct activity under the Law of the Sea Convention. And marine scientific research may be relatively freely conducted. However, it may not be used as the basis for private claims, which is interesting. So basically, basic research, collection of samples as research would be allowed under the Law of the Sea Convention. But if you make legal claims connected to your findings, that could be contested under the Law of the Sea Convention. And this raises really quite complex legal issues, especially in relation to samples found in the deep seas and then sort of put in biobanks, botanical collections, etc. What if you want to use them at a later stage as the basis for bioprospecting development? And to make matters worse, the Law of the Sea and its 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea is not the only regime in international law containing treaty obligations which are relevant for deep sea bioprospecting. In addition to the different legal principles of the Law of the Sea that needs to be taken into account, international environmental law has a lot to say about activities in the seas and relating to biological diversity of the sea. Most importantly, the Convention on Biological Diversity establishes general rules on conservation of biological diversity, including biological diversity in the seas, and the Nagoya Protocol, which is an agreement under the CBD, provides specific rules on genetic resources, foremost applying to areas within national jurisdiction, but some of these rules, especially the ones relating to obligations on conservation and so forth, also has relevance in waters beyond national jurisdiction. Thirdly, intellectual property rights law or WTO law sets obligations which are really quite relevant in relation to bioprospecting as well. Article 27 of the WTO agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights, TRIPS, actually says that states as a main or general rule are under obligation to enable patentability for discoveries made in genetic resources. There are possibilities under this TRIPS agreement to exclude certain organisms from patentability. Some states have done so. But for other types of organisms, for instance, microorganisms, states are actually not able to make exceptions. So for biodiscoveries made in microorganisms, states are under obligation to enable patentability, which makes the legal case or the legal situation for bioprospecting, which then involves sampling something in the deep sea, most commonly the deep sea bed, but possibly also the water column, taking it onto a research vessel, eventually on shore, exploring the genome of the organism, perhaps engineering or using genetic technology to modify the sample, and make legal claims in the form of patents connected to discoveries made in these organisms. This is an operation and a process which can be interpreted quite differently depending on what regime or what area of international law you highlight or you have your background in. So this makes for a complex situation. And in this book, I try to explain how these different understandings of the right to appropriate genetic resources relate to the context for the negotiation. But actually stay here for a while. So in a rather interesting way, these three different regimes of international law, each of them containing or having one treaty of central relevance to the use of genetic resources, they have been negotiated under different time periods. And in a rather interesting way, their legal regime or their legal understanding of the right to appropriate life reflects different ideological currents of their respective eras. The Law of the Sea Convention, with its common heritage of mankind principle, was negotiated in the 1970s. And this principle, which then sort of prevents private appropriation, can be seen as the result of a period when developing countries had an unusually high influence within the UN system. And the deep seabed regime is a rather peculiar and unique solution and system under international law. And then that can be contrasted to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which then promotes obligations for conservation in relation to biodiversity, generally speaking, but also highlights the importance of maintaining the right of states to genetic resources within their jurisdiction. This convention reflects the currents of the 1980s, and especially the sustainable development paradigm, which basically involved the logic that the developing countries would be compensated for access to their genetic resources economically in return for ensuring conservation. And then thirdly, intellectual property rights law as represented by TRIPS were negotiated during the Uruguay round of trade agreements of the World Trade Organizations, really dominated by the trade liberalization paradigm of the 1990s, strived to ensure patent rights, and also came to reflect a US case law which was very permissible in relation to patenting of genetic resources at the time. I think somebody's having their mic on. If you would be able to turn your mics off, that would be helpful because I hear a sound in my ear.
I think I can now. Yes.
Thanks. So three different treaties, three different legal regimes, which all reflect very different understandings of the right to appropriate lives, and also very different currents of international law. And as a consequence of these legal aspects, the same situation can be interpreted very differently depending on what regime of international law is given priority. And this is not only a theoretical problem. States do actually have different positions in relation to these issues. And allow me to highlight this by an example. A commercial enterprise commissions a marine research vessel and sails to the mid-Atlantic, well beyond the maritime zones of Atlantic coastal states. And there, a submarine vessel is sent down to harvest samples of marine organisms in the Extremophile tubeworm community situated at a hydrothermal vent. Ecosystems where organisms display functions which have not been identified elsewhere on the planet. And on board the research vessel, the DNA of a retrieved microorganism is sequenced, and in subsequent clinical trials on land, a protein discovered during sequestration is demonstrated to have tumor-inhibiting properties. A patent application is filed with prospects for the development of a commercially lucrative pharmaceutical drug. Now, under the interpretation of the United States, not only of its own treaty obligations, but of the implication of international law in general, there is nothing preventing such operations or the enterprise from applying for and being granted a patent, provided that the discovery meets standard requirements. In the view of, for instance, Argentina, by contrast, the actual bioprospecting mission would be unlawful without an express permit from the International Seabed Authority. Moreover, the findings would have to be shared universally. Any application for or granting of patents or other exclusive rights based on the finding would amount to illegal appropriation of a global resource belonging to all of humanity, in the understanding of Argentina. The European Union, thirdly, would consider it probably to be in line with international law to conduct the mission as such, provided that the conservation of the relevant ecosystem is not endangered. And much like the US, the EU would grant patents for the invention. They may, however, suggest that international law rules require that the benefits from the finding should somehow be shared. Now, how can the different legal perspectives across states be explained, considering that they are based on the same rules of international law? The diverging views on deep sea bioprospecting and the genetic resources of the deep seas, which also are reflected in domestic law, are the results of different understandings among states of what obligations apply to deep sea bioprospecting and what obligations should be given priority. So what we potentially have is it's a rather interesting conflict between different obligations under different treaties. Firstly, then, under the Law of the Sea Convention, saying that these resources are the common heritage of mankind, at least in the interpretation of many states of the Law of the Sea obligation. Private appropriation prohibited. Then we have international environmental law with the Convention on Biological Diversity, which says that these resources cannot be extracted without ensuring their conservation, something which may be difficult to do considering the endemic nature of the ecosystems and the difficulty of assessing environmental implications. And then thirdly, intellectual property rights law, which basically says that states are not only allowed, but actually under obligation to enable patenting of them. Patenting being, of course, a form of appropriating the content of a genetic resource, potentially in direct violation with this common heritage of mankind principle of the Law of the Sea. And what I do in the book is that I investigate if public international law manages to function as a coherent system. In this case of deep sea bioprospecting, where then rules in three regimes provide seemingly inconsistent obligations for states. And this problem connects to a broader discussion in public international law on fragmentation, a debate which started around the end of the Cold War, when there was a huge proliferation of treaties in international law, more treaties being negotiated, different legal regimes developing, and a perceived fear that this may result in conflict between the different legal areas. I very much see this problem that I've identified as a consequence of fragmentation, new obligations being negotiated without fully considering already existing ones in other fields of international law. In discussions on fragmentation from a theoretical standpoint, certain elements in treaty law have been considered to prevent or resolve these types of treaty conflict. Famously, a report to the International Law Commission was commissioned and edited by a rather prominent international law scholar, Matti Koskiniemi, some years ago on fragmentation of international law, where he essentially considered there to be certain elements of treaty law which prevent or resolve these types of treaty conflicts, basically by rules on priority, saying that certain treaties should be given priority, and also potentially if these mechanisms were unable to resolve such situation. There's also an element in treaty interpretation law called the principle of systemic integration, which basically entails that where there are several overlapping obligations, one obligation should be regarded or interpreted in light of the other ones, basically highlighting or advocating the potential interpretation of obligation which would be most in line with the other obligations, striving for finding a least common denominator, so to speak, and thereby avoiding conflict. And basically, the International Law Commission argued that these tools would probably be able to prevent or resolve these conflicts. But what I try to argue in my book is that while these tools may be appealing from an intellectual standpoint or a theoretical discussion, when facing practical problems, such as the one I've looked at in this specific case, they are really quite difficult to apply. If we look at the rules on priority among different treaties, it's not quite clear how they should apply to the current conflict. Different orders would follow depending on if you base a hierarchy on their negotiation, their entry into force, or when states have ratified the different conventions. And as regards systemic integration, that is based on the conception or the idea that there are areas of commonalities in all such problems or all potential conflicts. And while there may be potential interpretations which take all obligations into account for some elements of these problems, for instance, regarding to the water column, I would say, other areas of these problems are less easy to sort of look at from the perspective of systemic integration and find solutions. The most evident one being genetic resources from the deep seabed. So what I argue in my book is that this case shows that the interpretation tools in treaty law are not able in all cases to resolve treaty conflicts. And this practical case of bioprospecting being one such problematic case, which is really quite problematic considering the increasing interest for these types of resources and the commercial potential, and also the different interpretation of states, which may, of course, result in conflicts in one way or another. And also, just to wrap up, this connects to an ongoing negotiation with the United Nations on biological diversity beyond national jurisdiction, where different issues are being negotiated in concert, marine genetic resources being one of the negotiation areas in this negotiation, others being marine protected areas, area-based measures, benefit sharing, capacity building, and transfer of technology. So in this package, with these other issues, marine genetic resources are being negotiated to strive for new rules within the UN. However, I think this negotiation has sort of shunned away from some of the most important problems with these resources. Most importantly, the negotiation has been unable or unwilling to address the connections to intellectual property rights law. And also, it has really focused almost exclusively on the physical extraction in the sea. I think it would have been a whole lot better if genetic resources would have been addressed and negotiated in a standalone setting, not only from the perspective of the law of the sea, but also taking these other regimes of international law into consideration. The risk is otherwise that we'll, at the end of the day, have treaty obligations specifically relating to genetic resources, which will have limited practical relevance. yes, I think I'll end there. That way, we'll have some time for questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Krabbe.